This really happened to me, and I still feel the weight of it in my hands when I pick up a pot. I'm an ordinary grandmother from Seattle, and this is the part of my life I never imagined I'd have to tell, out loud. The betrayal began in a fluorescent-lit corner of Seattle Children's Hospital, where my daughter-in-law lifted my dented green Stanley thermos, unscrewed the cap, and with a hard little smile that cut like glass, poured my chicken soup straight into the biohazard bin. The mouth of the bin snapped shut with a hollow clack that echoed down the hallway, while my son stood there, paralyzed, and my grandson whimpered in his stroller. We were gathered there because Leo, my sweet, moon-cheeked Leo, couldn't keep anything down and had been losing weight, and the only thing he'd sipped all day was a breath of steam from that soup. The smell of ginger, dill, and roasted bones drifted up and then vanished, just like that, swallowed by a plastic maw and a pair of latexed hands that weren't even mine. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I had cooked the soup early that morning in my Ballard bungalow, the same kitchen where I raised my son, Evan, where I'd shelled peas at the table with him and taught him the difference between a simmer and a boil. The pot was the old blue enamel one I've had since 1985. Chipped along the rim, handle loose, but it held decades of Sunday afternoons, neighbors who dropped by with rhubarb, and the quiet after storms. I'd started with a carcass from Queen Anne's Eden Hill Provisions. Good bones I saved in the freezer. 2 carrots, a celery stalk, a knob of ginger, an onion charred on the burner, the way my mother taught me in Yonkers. A handful of dill, bay leaves, water that kissed the line beneath the rivets, a slow, whispering simmer that fogged the windows while the rain came down in sheets. I didn't make the soup to prove a point. I made it because Leo had been sick for a week, and the pediatrician had said, "Small sips of broth are fine if he'll take it." Marissa, my daughter-in-law, disagreed because, of course, she did. "He needs a reset," she'd texted, sending me a link to a cleanse she'd designed for her followers. Apple cucumber mint juice, bone broth only from her approved supplier, and some brand of electrolyte powder that cost more than my last oil change. The powder came in a rose gold tin with a serif font and the words glow, cleanse, reset, each word on its own proud line, like commandments. When I arrived at the hospital, the waiting room was divided by a coral reef of molded plastic chairs in colors that used to be cheerful before they were dulled by human worry. Parents clutched iPads like talismans. A TV mounted near the fish tank churned out a loop of sea turtles and soft waves. I could see Evan's hunched shoulders from across the room, his hand pushing the stroller back and forth in a rhythm he must have picked up from nights in the nursery. Marissa sat rigidly beside him, her hair in a high, slicked bun, the kind that looks civilized until you notice how it pulls the face toward severity. She wore a beige wool coat draped over her shoulders like a cape and sneakers that were never meant to touch rain. "Mom," my son said when I approached, and his voice pinched in that childlike place that always unthreads me. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," I said, lifting the thermos from my tote. "It's just broth. Warm. He can sip." Marissa's glance slid to the thermos, and her lips curved, not quite a smile. "We're not doing that." Before I could answer, a nurse told us a room had opened, and we followed her down the corridor, where the floors were clean enough to see the reflection of the emergency exit signs. The nurse swung us into an exam room. Curtain, sink, blood pressure cuff, like a bicycle inner tube. Leo made a small sound, a thin kitten sound, and I had the cap off the thermos before I really planned to. And the steam rushed up, a little cloud that smelled like every winter my family's ever survived. "No," Marissa said sharper now, and she moved so fast, her hand on the thermos, a twist, that curve of her mouth flattening into attack. "We're not sabotaging his reset with sodium." It should have been a small thing, a family squabble about soup in a place the size of a small airport. But the way she lifted the thermos high, the way she held it over the biohazard bin like a trophy, the arc of liquid, amber, with a glimmer of fat that's hard-won, a promise of calories, and then the hollow thud as it fell, and the bin swallowed it whole. The room went quiet in that soft, reeling way after a glass shatters. Evan exhaled slowly, as if he were underwater, and had finally made it to the surface. Something ruptured, not a dramatic slash, but a small rip in something tender you didn't realize you were holding tight. I stood there with the empty thermos in my hand, the heat of it shocking my palm, and I thought, I made that for him. I made that with my hands. "You shouldn't have brought it," Marissa said, soft as if she were comforting me, the way people talk to skittish animals. "You know how hard we're working on his microbiome." "He needs calories," I said, "because truth survives better when it's simple." "He needs to detox," she said, and then the door opened again, and the doctor came in, brisk, competent, young enough to be a nephew, with a badge that read, "Chang, Nathan, M.D." I can tell about the humiliation now, but at the time I tucked it into myself like a handkerchief you don't show. I moved to the sink, rinsed the thermos, and stood so the trembling in my shoulders would be something private between me and the stainless steel. The doctor asked questions while he listened to the small lungs of my grandson. How many days of vomiting, wet diapers, fevers. He asked what Leo had eaten. He asked about weight loss. He asked about stools, because the body tells the truth in crude ways. "Broth isn't food," Marissa said when the word broth came up again, and the doctor tipped his head. Not a disagreement, exactly, but curiosity. "Sometimes it's a start," he said, and his eyes caught the thermos in the sink, the last gold drop clinging to the inside like a stubborn star. "Where'd the broth go?" "It wasn't appropriate," Marissa said. I dried the thermos with a paper towel, just to have something to do with my hands. "I can make more," I said. "It's nothing." The doctor looked at me for a beat longer than a stranger should. "A good broth is never nothing," he said. We ended up in observation. The IV took 3 tries. Leo's cry became a hoarse complaint only mothers and grandmothers can decode. Part exhaustion, part bewilderment, part accusation. I watched the bag drip the way you watch rain from a porch, steady, indifferent, life-saving. Marissa carved a prison for herself on the vinyl chair and built a little wall with her phone, her notifications, her universe of approval and likes. Evan put his head in his hands. I set the empty thermos upright on the counter, as if barrels of soup might appear from thin air if I only made room. If you live in Seattle long enough, you learn to carry the rain inside you so you don't drown in it. I told myself I'd make another batch as soon as I got home. Start the oven to roast the bones low, let the onion blacken on the coil for that whisper of smoke. I'd bring it right back. But what lodged in me wasn't the soup. It was the look my daughter-in-law gave me when she poured it away. A cool, almost tender pity. Like I was the one who didn't understand what you're supposed to feed a child you love. We weren't always like this. When Evan first brought Marissa to my house, back when they were living in a studio off Dexter, sharing a queen mattress on the floor and a calendar like a hand-drawn map, they arrived with a bottle of Columbia Valley Red and a mango. She was a swirl of compliments then. She admired the glass doorknobs in my hallway, the old map of Puget Sound I bought at an estate sale, the hand-stitched quilt I keep on the back of the couch for chilly nights. She laughed at my stories about library patrons and the secret presidents that live in the stacks, Grover Cleveland hiding in the 973.8s like a shy raccoon. She ate seconds of my spaghetti and sopped up the sauce with garlic bread, polite in the way that's theater, unless you mean it. She clapped when the soufflé rose and put her napkin on her lap. She said, "Evan says you make the best soup in the world." Back then, I liked her, or I liked the idea of her, which is not the same thing, but sometimes feels safer. They married at the Graham Visitors Center in the Washington Park Arboretum, with lanterns strung from the beams, and a guitarist who kept pausing to tune because of the humidity. We had pizza from Delancey and cupcakes from Cupcake Royale. At midnight, a raccoon wandered into the venue like a moral from a fable, and all of us, couples, kids, elders, stopped and stared back at it, and the raccoon looked like it had something important to tell us, and then changed its mind. When it rained, we cheered. That's how in love they were. Even the rain felt like blessing. The baby came 2 years later, and no one's born ready for how a tiny human reorders your molecules. I'd show up with casseroles and diaper-scented trash bags and wipes purchased in flats at Costco, like a gambler, placing all my bets on clean. Marissa thanked me, sometimes with words, sometimes with nothing but a text heart. She curated his life like a gallery. Little camel-colored knits, Scandinavian wooden toys, whites that kept appearing bright no matter how often a child's hands went to war against them. She used the word toxins like a person might say dust or lint. So often it hovered above us like a cloud. Then the feed of her life began to outpace her life. Glow with Riss, her Instagram, took off. Sponsored posts with aluminum-free deodorant, avocado oil that came in a bottle the color of sunset, supplements that promised to restore you to the you were meant to be if you could only access it. She bought a ring light. She wrote in a font that looked like the handwriting of a woman who never raised her voice. She called herself a certified pediatric nutritionist and posted client transformations that showed toddlers going from sallow to rosy after 2 weeks of her plan, as if children swap out their faces like pillowcases every Sunday. Certified by who? I asked once, but only to myself. Little slippages began, the way she corrected me, gently, like sanding away a rough edge she didn't want to look at. "We say plant forward now, Joan, not vegetables." The way she insisted Leo was sensitive to certain foods he'd never tried. The way she tilted her head when I offered to babysit, like a doctor about to deliver a diagnosis you won't like. Evan worked long hours for Amazon, SDE2, which sounded like a ranking for a type of rocket fuel, not a person. He wore the pale, on-call blues under his eyes like a badge. He wasn't there for tiny decisions that built the tower of a day. He tried. Lord knows he tried. He'd reach for Marissa's hand during dinner, and she'd squeeze back while she watched her notifications bloom. The day Leo started vomiting, I brought Pedialyte. She refused it because of colorings. I brought electrolyte packets they use in hospitals. She said, "Do you know what those do to a microbiome?" I stopped myself from saying, "They save a child's life." I called the pediatrician's office and left a message. They called me back because Seattle is still small enough to feel like a village if you know which doors to knock on. "Broth is fine," the nurse said. "Sips. Hydration is most important." So I made soup, and I carried it through rain to the hospital, and Marissa poured it into a bin meant for blood and needles and teeth and God knows what else, and I stood there with my hands empty, except for a thermos I couldn't fill at that moment if I begged the sky. The doctor came back with labs and a calm face. His calmness felt practiced, like the smooth inside of a stone you keep in your pocket and rub when you need to believe in something. "He's dehydrated," Dr. Chang said. "We'll keep him for a bit, get him some fluids, see how he tolerates oral liquids in a few hours." "Can we get a different IV?" Marissa asked. "I don't like this one." "We got a good vein," he said. "Switching would create more trauma than comfort." "I mean a different fluid," she said. "Without sugar." Dr. Chang paused. "Sugar helps, not just for calories. The transport mechanism for sodium in the gut." He stopped himself, maybe because he realized he was about to lecture a woman who believed she could bend the body to a trend. He glanced at me again, and I couldn't tell if he was asking for permission to say more or forgiveness for saying less. When he left, I stepped into the hallway for air. I walked to the end where floor-to-ceiling windows framed a gray sheet of city and the needlepoint spire of the Space Needle like a pinned insect. I texted my neighbor Lottie, who used to clerk at King County Superior Court, and who still knows where to find the practical side of any situation. I wrote, "She poured the soup into the biohazard bin." "Can you believe?" Lottie texted back. "Believe? I can picture. People are wild about control when they're scared. Also, I have a cake in the oven. Do you want a slice later?" Because Lottie understands a fundamental truth about the world. Cake is a kind of triage. I turned to go back, and that's when I saw him in the doorway with a chart in his hands and my empty thermos visible behind me in the mirror of the shiny steel cabinet. Dr. Chang cleared his throat once. The way you do when you're about to ask a question, you've already decided to ask for reasons you don't entirely want to explain. "Who made that broth?" he said, and his voice was very even. "I did," I said. He looked from the thermos to me and back again, then closed the door behind him so the hall noise dulled. "If you're willing," he said, like he was asking for a kindness, not a recipe, "I'd like to know exactly how you made it." I could feel the air go still on the other side of the curtain where Marissa sat. Her shoulders rose like a cat's back when it sees a rival. Evan looked at me over the edge of his exhaustion with something like hope turning on inside him, a porch light coming on at dusk. "I'll tell you," I said. "But first, Doctor, can you tell me what you're seeing that makes you ask?" He nodded. The way you nod at someone who understands there are two conversations happening at once. The one about soup and the one about power. "It smelled like a broth made for someone you love," he said. "And sometimes that's the difference." That's when Marissa stepped from behind the curtain, her phone already up like a shield pitched at my chest. "We're not taking advice from unlicensed cooks," she said. "We need solutions, not nostalgia." And in that instant, while the rain pressed its face to the window and the monitors sang their little math, something in me, something that had been soft and grandmotherly and infinitely patient, stopped being afraid of the word fight. Because if this was going to be a war, I knew how to keep records, and I knew how to cook, and I knew how to hold a line. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was how far Marissa would go to make sure the only story that survived was hers. I didn't sleep that night. After they admitted Leo to observation and told us to go home and rest, I walked alone from the hospital down to University Village, because sometimes you need to be somewhere that smells like anthropology candles and pretzels just to remember people buy mugs and cashmere socks on days when the world feels like a hallway with no doors. I went into Fran's Chocolates and asked for one sea salt caramel, and the young man behind the counter looked me in the eye and said, "Would you like milk or dark?" And I almost cried, because he said it like my choice mattered. I took the caramel outside and ate it in 2 bites and planned. I'd make more broth and bring it first thing. I'd print the pediatrician's note that said, "Broth is fine," and put it in my purse like a passport. I'd bring a small ceramic mug with a lid, something that didn't look like a thermos, to sidestep Marissa's rules, the way you learn to sidestep a crack in the sidewalk that always catches your toe. I passed the pottery barn, where couples were arguing over dining chairs, and I remembered when Evan was 7 and got the stomach flu so bad he slept on the bathroom floor with his arm around the base of the toilet, like a sailor blackout drunk. I sat beside him and fed him ice chips with a spoon I'd bought at Goodwill, and every chip felt like an offering I had stolen back from a god who wanted to swallow my child whole. Back home, the house smelled faintly of soup and wet wool. I washed the thermos and started again, not because I believed in soup like a talisman, but because it gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to form a shape that looked like a plan. I roasted bones low with the last carrot and a cross-hatched onion. I scraped brown bits into the pot, added water, and let it hover, the way you let an apology hover in your throat until the other person is ready to hear it. I skimmed the fat and saved it in a jar, because I don't throw away what the body needs. I put in dill and ginger and a splash of apple cider vinegar, because my mother said it coaxes minerals from bones, and because faith is often as small as a splash. At 2 a.m., the house creaked the way old houses do, a language of settling that has more to do with wind than with ghosts. I ladled the broth into the thermos and screwed the cap, then sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, a habit from decades at the reference desk. When something is bigger than you, write it down until it isn't. I wrote, Marissa poured the soup into biohazard bin. I wrote, Dr. Chang asked for recipe. I wrote, Leo dehydrated. I wrote, broth okay per nurse. I wrote, save texts, document everything. And then I wrote, as if it were a heading for a chapter, I refused to let end badly. I will not let her starve him of what he needs to grow. The next morning, Seattle was a wet newspaper stuck to the sky. I parked in the garage and rehearsed a version of the day where kindness conquered strategy. I imagined handing the thermos to Marissa and saying, let's just try a sip, and her saying, okay, and the nurse smiling and Leo drinking, and a small piece of the world clicking back into place, like a drawer that hadn't been closing right for months. Upstairs, the observation ward hummed. When I walked into the room, the first thing I saw was Leo's face, less gray, more color pooling at his cheeks, like he'd been in a good dream. The IV was still in, but the bag had less to give. Evan looked at me and straightened. He'd changed the t-shirt he'd slept in for another t-shirt that looked almost identical, and somehow that felt like optimism. Marissa was perched at the window, scrolling. I set the thermos on the counter. "Morning," I said. "I brought more." Marissa didn't look up. "We're doing a coconut water trial first," she said. "Doctor's orders." "Actually," came Dr. Chong's voice from the doorway, "my orders were to try small amounts of clear liquids, whatever he'll keep down. Coconut water is fine if he'll take it. So is broth." He reached for the chart, flipped a page. "Do you have the recipe?" he asked me, and he said it the way people ask for a good mechanic, like it might save a life if you write down the right number. Marissa's head lifted. "You cannot be serious," she said. "You can't possibly encourage an unregulated food product." He didn't flinch. "We encourage calories," he said. "We encourage hydration. We encourage whatever works." Marissa laughed, a small, incredulous puff. "You're going to put that on his chart? Grandma soup?" "Yes," Dr. Chang said. "Yeah, because record-keeping matters." If you want to know the moment I decided to stop being afraid of Marissa, it was that one. A doctor saying out loud that a thing I did with my hands was real enough to write where other professionals would read it. I felt my spine lift in my body as if someone had threaded a wire through my vertebrae and pulled gently until I remembered how to stand. I started to speak, to list the bones, the aromatics, the ratios, all the small decisions that make a broth more than salted water and less than miracle. The words felt like church, and I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the way Marissa's jaw hardened, the way her thumb skimmed her phone like a match skimming a strike plate. And then, because stories about power don't take breaks, her phone pinged, and her face changed the way a sky changes when a storm has been waiting just out of frame. She lifted the phone, turned the screen so only she could see, and said very softly, "Oh, what?" Evan asked. She smiled at me in a way that made my molars ache. "Nothing," she said. "Just confirmation that some people don't know how far screenshots travel." She tucked the phone into her coat pocket like she was putting away a weapon and smoothed her hair with the flat of her palm. I would not see that post, her post, about me, until later that afternoon when a neighbor sent it to me with a question mark. I would not see the caption until I was back home in my kitchen, standing very still over the sink. But I could feel the first ripple of it now, moving outward from that "oh," like a crack, forming in a pane of glass, large enough to be a wall. "Well?" I said. "Are we going to feed the baby?" Marissa looked at my thermos. She looked at Dr. Chang. She looked at Leo. She did nothing. "Tell me the rest of the recipe," Dr. Chang said, and I began, because sometimes you answer the question you can answer, while the larger war rearranges itself around you, like furniture being moved in a room you own but don't recognize. I told him, and in telling, I heard the shape of my plan harden in the air between us. Because if my daughter-in-law's strength was a story she could fling to thousands in a second, mine would be the kind you build with facts and heat and time, the kind you hand a doctor. The kind you write down so you can stand up in a courtroom, if it came to that, and say, "Here is what happened. Here is what I did. Here is the truth, and I can prove it." What I couldn't know, what none of us could, not even the man with the neat pen and the steady hands, was that a different kind of recipe was already cooking, one that had less to do with bone and dill, and more to do with screenshots, and the power of strangers to decide what kind of woman you are without ever meeting you. And while Dr. Chang wrote my ingredients into the chart in a tidy script, and while Leo's eyelids fluttered like moth, wings in sleep, and while the rain scraped at the window like it was cold and wanted in, Marissa's phone buzzed again. "Interesting," she murmured. It would be hours before I saw what she'd done with my soup. Not the part she threw away, the part she kept, which was the story. And by then, the comments would be a bonfire. I went home that afternoon to shower and bring fresh clothes, and I stopped by PCC to pick up more dill. The cashier, a woman with sleeve tattoos of ferns, asked me if I wanted my receipt, and I said yes, because I was beginning to understand that receipts can become a language when people start telling lies. When I got home, I put the groceries on the counter, set the thermos in the sink, and turned on the kettle. The radiator clicked twice, and then began to do its small miracle of warmth. My phone was face down by habit. I flipped it over, because habit is no defense against curiosity. And there it was. A text from my neighbor Hannah 2 doors down. It was a link to a post, and the caption read, simply, "You seeing this?" Her ... bubbled like a pot about to boil, and then vanished. I clicked, and Marissa's face appeared. Perfect skin, perfect lighting, a mother's grief borrowed like a cardigan. The caption, "When someone ignores your carefully designed protocol and tries to sneak processed sodium-laden sludge into your baby's body at the hospital, because that's what we've always done. Remember, not all help is helpful. Boundaries, microbiome. Trust your gut." And there, right there, was a photo of my thermos, the green dent unmistakable, taken on the sterile counter like a mugshot. The comments were already a river working itself toward flood. "OMG, who would do that? My Mael tried to give my baby store broth, I kid you not. Call security. Report her. Sodium kills babies." My hand went cold where it held the phone. Hannah's message popped back in. "Want me to come over?" And Lottie's text came winging in right on its heels. "Don't panic. Archive everything. Screenshots of screenshots. Date, time. We'll bake a cake and we'll plan." I was not a woman who dragged people online. I wasn't even a woman who used the word drag outside of a library cart context. But I knew the reference desk trick, where you map the whole question, not just the part the person knew to ask. If people were going to decide who I was from a photo of a thermos, I would be the kind of woman who kept better records than anyone who came for me. The kettle clicked. I poured hot water into a mug and didn't drink it. I opened my laptop, made a folder, titled it Marissa Documentation, and began to stack proof like a wall of bricks I intended to climb. I screen recorded her post in case she changed the caption. I took screenshots of comments where strangers said my soup was toxic sludge. I scrolled, more comments, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and I looked for ones that said things that weren't just mean, but actionable. The ones where people said, "Report her to CPS." The ones where someone wrote, "I did, I called." I heard my own breath. I heard the rain. I heard the scrape of a neighbor's garbage can against the curb. I heard the little tick in the baseboard where the house adjusts to weather it has seen 1,000 times. Then another message slipped into my screen. Not from a neighbor, not from a friend, but from an unknown number that had once been familiar, because I knew that area code like a reflex. Yonkers, where I grew up. It was a photo, no caption, and the photo was of the biohazard bin with my soup pooling like amber glass at the bottom, beside a smear of something red that wasn't mine. The angle told me someone had leaned close. The clarity told me someone wanted me to see. And beneath the photo, a single message. Which broth doesn't work here? Stay in your lane, Joan. I stared at the screen until the letters swam. My hands shook, but my voice did not when I said, out loud to my empty kitchen, all right then, because a librarian knows how to find things other people hid. A mother knows how to feed a body, and a grandmother, especially one who has had her soup thrown out in a hospital like it was poison, knows how to make the slow kind of trouble that starts with paper and ends, if you do it right, with a judge saying your name out loud while the person who lied about you sits very still. I picked up my pen, drew a tidy box on the yellow legal pad, and wrote a title inside it like a headline you'd see in the Seattle Times. What happened in room 412? Who poured what? Who told the truth? And what a doctor asked me that changed everything. And then, with a calm that felt like standing barefoot in cold grass, I dialed a number I hadn't thought I'd ever need, the Consumer Affairs desk at the newspaper. The line rang twice. A man answered. His voice was youthful but lined with coffee. Seattle Times, City Desk. Hello, I said, and when I heard my own voice, it sounded like something made of fur, not easily bent. My name is Joan Navarro. I have a story about a health influencer, a hospital, and a pot of soup, and I have proof. He didn't say, go on in the way that means hurry. He said, go on in the way that means I'm listening, which is the first time in this whole mess I felt the line across my heart pull taut in the right direction. First, I said, you should know this really happened to me, and that I make a very good broth. And while he chuckled at that, because he understood that a good line is just a spoon you use to serve truth, my doorbell rang. That'll be my neighbor, I said. She's bringing cake. Because if you're going to war with a woman who controls the story, you bring receipts, and you bring cake, and you open the door to the people who will stand behind you when the wind picks up and the comments ignite like dry grass. I lifted the latch. I did not know yet that on the other side of the cake would be a subpoena. And I did not know yet that the doctor would want more than a recipe. I only knew this. The next time someone tried to throw away my soup, they'd need a better bin. The end.